Truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Thursday, October 10th, 2024, the 1,359th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you will get the ad-free experience. You'll be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you'll be invited to the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't, or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the free version on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'm your moderator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin, and you feel better about precious metals. I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company. And that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right, so I want to get started today with something that we've discussed a number of times over the past couple of months, and that's the report compiled by the International Crisis Group in March of 2020 with the headline, Imagining a Resolution of Venezuela's Crisis. Now, as I've pointed out a number of times, the International Crisis Group is a global regime think tank chaired by Mark Malloch Brown. that has on its board George Soros and his son Alexander, among others. It partners with transnational banks like HSBC and transnational corporations, including and especially energy companies like BP, Chevron, and Shell. Venezuela, of course, is an oil and resource-rich nation that, under the leadership of Nicolas Maduro, is not on board with the global regime's plan. This is a country they must control, and it's not working out. Of course, that doesn't stop them. They believe they have a right to control Venezuela. We witnessed it this summer as we saw the color revolution playbook play out in Caracas and the claims that Nicolas Maduro had stolen his reelection. But going back to that report from the International Crisis Group, I just want to read the first paragraph of the executive summary. It says, since January 2019, Venezuela has had two competing presidencies and two starkly different views on how its political struggle should be resolved. It has also had one principal victim, a population exposed to a catastrophic human crisis. Over a year on, neither side has achieved its goals. President Nicolas Maduro remains in power. Crippling sanctions are still in place, and a solution hovers well out of sight. With the government feeling more confident, as shown by its 5 January seizure of the National Assembly, and the opposition harboring unrealistic ambitions of swift regime change, outside parties should consider stepping up their involvement, presenting a settlement that restores fair political competition, triggers an early presidential election, and incrementally lifts sanctions, and press their respective allies within the country to accept it as a basis for negotiations. So essentially, they want to increase pressure. They want to add additional incentives if the Venezuelans choose to go along with the global regime program. They will also ramp up the punishments. This is often referred to as the carrot and the stick. The goal is to achieve what they call fair elections as early as possible. The fairness of those elections will be based on whether or not Nicolas Maduro is pressured to or chooses to step down from power. Now, this report was written 4.5 years ago, and obviously nothing has changed. Nicolas Maduro is still in power. In fact, he's stronger now than he was then. But I want to focus on that part about there being two presidencies. One of those presidencies, Nicolas Maduro's presidency, actually controls the affairs in Venezuela, and the military is on his side. The other presidency, quote unquote, doesn't actually exist at all, except from the perspective of the global regime. They are the quote unquote opposition who's being supported by individuals and entities linked to groups like the International Crisis Group and its partners. Just a couple of months prior to the publication of this report, Donald Trump at the State of the Union actually recognized the Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela. Now, I believe he did this as a meaningless concession to the global regime and a genius bit of narrative shielding, as my friend Burning Bright would say, that has lasted him until this day. There was a clip going around last week of Nicolas Maduro saying that he and Trump were supposed to meet, and he believes that if they had met, they would have been good friends, but they never met. Through moves like the recognition of Guaido, Trump is hands off when it comes to Nicolas Maduro. His hands are clean. No one can blame Donald Trump for allying with Venezuela, because it's very difficult to make a compelling argument otherwise when he came out and formally recognized the opposition leader as the global regime wanted him to. We've seen a similar dynamic with a number of world leaders. But the key takeaway is that one of the presidents, quote unquote, is recognized by the global regime. That's the person they do business with. And that, quote unquote, president is enabled to exercise whatever power they can muster on behalf of the global regime. It's just a matter of how much power they're able to muster. Do they control the military? Are they seen by the people as legitimate? And that question could be rephrased in the framing discussed the other day. Do they have a public mandate? Or do their narratives constantly fail? Are they seen as clueless and feckless and unable to enact their agenda? Because what really matters is not who the global governing bodies recognize as the legitimate, in their view, president of a nation. What matters is who actually commands the power of that office in a given nation. And in that sense, there were not two presidents in Venezuela at that time. There was Nicolas Maduro and a quote-unquote opposition leader whose only ostensible claim to legitimacy was the support of the global regime, its money, and its propaganda media. I would argue, as I have before, that we are in the exact same situation here in the United States of America. The global regime, the moneyed interests, the international finance, and the global propaganda media all support the legitimacy of the fake President Joe Biden, who, we're told, achieved an utterly impossible 81 million real lawful American votes, despite being wholly unable to prove it. We are told Donald Trump lost, was removed from office, and is no longer president and no longer commander-in-chief, at least according to that same global regime. But in reality, is the military on the side of Donald Trump or the fake President Joe Biden and the global regime? And who has the public mandate? The fake President Joe Biden or Donald Trump? It's clearly Donald Trump, and we are in the process over these years of proving that, so that the American people understand what the American people collectively actually represent, minus the brainwashing, minus the psyops, minus the propaganda media, minus the fake elections. And so I want to talk about those fake elections today and what might follow, what must be done in order for Trump to become once again publicly recognized as the president and or commander-in-chief of the United States of America. And to frame this, I want to flash back to an interesting statement delivered at the end of Donald Trump's first term by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo.
I'm currently preparing to engage with the Biden transition team, and if not, at what point does a delay hamper a smooth transition or pose a risk to national security?
There will be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration. All right? We're ready. The world is watching what's taking place here. We're going to count all the votes. When the process is complete, there'll be electors selected. There's a process. The Constitution lays it out pretty clearly. The world should have every confidence that the transition necessary to make sure that the State Department is functional today, successful today, and successful with the president who's in office on January 20th, mid-afternoon, will also be successful. I went through a transition on the front, and I've been on the other side of this. I'm very confident that we will do all the things that are necessary to make sure that the government, the United States government, will continue to perform its national security function as we go forward.
So you believe there's widespread voter fraud, that the reports that we're getting from Pennsylvania, from Michigan, showing vote totals in massive leads or significant leads with 99% reporting are going to be overturned, and that the United States failed to conduct a fraudulent free election?
Rich, I'm the Secretary of State. I'm getting calls from all across the world. These people are watching our election. They understand that we have a legal process. They understand that this takes time, right? It took us 37 plus days in an election back in 2000. We conducted a successful transition then. I'm very confident that we will count, and we must count every legal vote. We must make sure that any vote that wasn't lawful ought not be counted. That dilutes your vote if it's done improperly. Got to get that right. When we get it right, we'll get it right. We're in good shape.
Should foreign leaders not be calling
We're in good shape.
President-elect?
A smooth transition to a second Trump administration. Was he talking about in January of 2021? Was he talking about in January of 2025? Or was he just wrong? Maybe Mike Pompeo had no idea what he was talking about, and there was never going to be a second Trump administration. People are very concerned about how, if the elections are still rigged, or the TV says that Kamala Harris, the fake vice president, won that rigged election, it's going to be impossible to transition to that second or third Trump administration. How is it going to happen? Is the military going to have to take over? And that, of course, assumes that the military hadn't already taken over, not when the entire Capitol was surrounded with a fence and soldiers. The military will have to take over sometime in the future to remove the already illegitimate Biden administration that operates out of fake White Houses. It's worth remembering that Donald Trump did not lose, did not concede. Neither the elections nor the electors were ever properly certified, and Joe Biden wasn't properly inaugurated. He has not carried out a real or legitimate presidency, and we are told that all the time by none other than Donald Trump, but everybody just assumes, well, that must be a euphemism because the television and the global regime tell me differently. And so we grovel and tremble in fear about losing an election, wondering if the fake President Joe Biden, who does not seem to possess any actual power or information right now, will just pass that torch to Kamala Harris. She will assume all his special fake presidential powers and rule us forever. Nothing can stop what's coming unless each and every person shows up at a local high school cafeteria or perhaps an NBA arena and presses a bunch of buttons on an iPad attached to a black box that forces the television to tell us we won. Nothing can stop what's coming unless we all admit the truth that our elections are fake. And not just a little fake, not just a little rigged. They are the same as they are in Venezuela. The system is operated by the same global regime trying to remove Nicolas Maduro from power. The same global regime that has no problem recognizing two presidents when the real president is someone who's not on their side, but calls us treasonous insurrectionists if we reserve the right to do the same. So let's discuss the current state of our elections and think about how we might transition out of this crazy period, because it must be something far grander than us just simply recognizing that Joe Biden is not now and has never been a real or legitimate president. It must be more complicated. We must get the courts involved. We must seek approval from higher authorities. We can't just determine these things for ourselves, can we? Let's start here with the Daily Mail from yesterday. Could Hurricane Milton stop Trump winning the election? Top pollster Craig Kashishian reveals how devastation in these key Republican strongholds could radically reshape the race. Now, we just went through a very similar narrative last week in regard to Hurricane Helene and those counties in western North Carolina that might have difficulty voting. Of course, they're all predominantly Republican counties. So that means if they're not able to vote, if it's a close election in North Carolina, and we're told that's exactly what it's going to be, well, then the regime might be able to steal North Carolina. And of course, the underlying assumptions in that statement are that North Carolina would otherwise be holding a real and legitimate election, that they actually count the votes properly, that it's a close race according to fake news polls, which we would have to then assume are true, and that the difference in the very real and very truthfully reported election results was created by the disenfranchisement of Western North Carolina voters due to Hurricane Helene. And of course, none of those things are true. North Carolina just has rigged elections. Their election results are going to be illegitimate no matter who is declared the winner there. Nothing can stop what is coming unless we fail to preserve the vote for those Republicans negatively affected by Hurricane Helene. And if you understand that these things are actually resolved at much higher levels than our digital manipulation of an iPad screen attached to a black box, it becomes readily apparent just how silly this is. Let's hear what the Daily Mail has to say about Florida, though. Nearly every modern U.S. presidential cycle has been upended by an unforeseen surprise of one sort or another. Oh, you don't say. There's always a narrative trick there right at the end that fully explains all of the election results, no matter what happened before. Wow, who could ever guess? In July 1972, Democratic presidential candidate George McGovern was shocked to learn after his party's summer convention that his running mate, Thomas Eagleton, had secretly received electroshock therapy to treat bouts of depression. That was enough to discredit Eagleton with the grand poobahs of the Democrat Party and help doom McGovern's campaign. Oh, yeah, of course that was it. 8 years later, I was working as a strategist for Ronald Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign when my bosses coined the phrase October surprise. They were concerned that our opponent, President Jimmy Carter, would transform the race by negotiating a last-minute deal with armed Iranian revolutionaries to release the 53 American hostages who had been held in Tehran for over a year. Of course, everyone wanted the hostages released, no matter what the circumstances, but it was our job to anticipate the potential political fallout of such an event. Honestly, this sounds like a confession. Now, in 2024, here we are again. It's early October, less than 4 weeks until the election, and there's another October surprise in the making. This one is not man-made. Right, totally. Who would ever assume a hurricane was man-made? It is not the result of an unforced error by a candidate behaving badly. It is an act of God bearing down on the critical swing state of Florida. Florida is not a swing state. Think about how many falsehoods you would have already had to accept to still be on board with the premise of this argument. The author emotes about how much he cares for hurricane victims and then says, but it is my job to consider what may happen. And I've concluded that Milton may be a game changer come November 5th. Let me explain. In the 2020 election, Donald Trump defeated Joe Biden in Florida by over 370,000 votes, which equates to barely 3 percentage points. And that's strange because Ron DeeSantis absolutely blew out Charlie Crist in the 2022 midterms despite receiving fewer votes than Donald Trump did. Isn't that amazing? But those 3 points, Kashishian says, were a decent margin in the Sunshine State, but not a dominant one. Trump won in 2020 in part by running up the Republican tally in ruby red GOP counties like Pasco, Marion, and Sarasota near Tampa. Big turnouts in those Republican strongholds offset Democrat wins in blue regions of the state like Miami-Dade County in Florida's southeast. And those are not strong blue areas like they were. But now Hurricane Milton is blowing its way right into the heart of Florida, and places like Pasco and Sarasota lie directly in its path. The author then goes through his data-based argument, including data about the population, which is falsified, about voter registrations, which is falsified, and about prior election outcomes, which were falsified. But if you assume that all that data is true and this author is making a direct argument in good faith, which he's not, then maybe you can get on board with what he's saying. Maybe the potential devastation would be enough to change the election outcome. Let's jump down to the end where he ties it all up for us. There's a measure on the ballot that would establish a right to abortion in the Florida Constitution, and another that would legalize recreational marijuana. Many of my fellow Republican strategists underestimated the electoral impact of abortion measures on the ballot in the 2020 midterms, and I think he must have meant 2022, as they predicted a red wave for the GOP across the country. And so recall that narrative. They rigged and stole elections on ballot measures on abortion, and then used those rigged and stolen election results to justify and rationalize other rigged and stolen election results, and then blamed it all on MAGA. The author assumes the full legitimacy of our elections, including and especially those ones on the abortion measures, saying the GOP underestimated their impact and never achieved the red wave everyone thought would be coming. All of that is now used to justify the case that abortion measures in different states throughout the country will be responsible for the achieving of results that are otherwise totally unexplainable. Back to the Daily Mail, he says, I thought otherwise and said so on national television at the time. Oh, what a genius prognosticator. Indeed, the red wave never materialized. There is reason for Donald Trump's campaign to be concerned. Florida Governor Ron DeeSantis is an honorable guy, and he understands his primary duty is to protect people and property in his state. But I'm hoping the governor's office, amongst its many initiatives in the coming days, also thinks of how voters may be disenfranchised by this storm. Perhaps the governor can loosen absentee voting rules, or better yet, attach an absentee ballot, Democrat and Republican, to every aid packet that his Office of Emergency Management distributes. By doing so, the governor will fulfill his obligations to protect life as well as democracy. no race should be won because Americans couldn't vote. Isn't that incredible? His concern trolling over the disenfranchisement of Republican voters who hold a dominating edge, especially in those regions of Florida most impacted by Hurricane Milton, that's definitely not man-made, comes with a recommendation that the regime's election fraud apparatus be supported and enhanced by Ron DeSantis. And everyone should keep an eye on this. Is Ron DeSantis going to try to change election processes in favor of the election fraud apparatus using Hurricane Milton as a justification? I mean, we gotta hope that Ron DeSantis would not do something like that, or that if he did, it's just kayfabe, am I right? Who is going to be available to call Ron DeSantis out on that? Well, no one, because we're told it was all kayfabe. And we're now being told that if he makes concessions to the regime's election fraud apparatus, he'll be doing so for the benefit of Republicans. It's like that meme with the rapper Drake. He loves one thing and hates the other. An unaccounted for excess of absentee ballots for COVID? Very bad. An unaccounted for excess of absentee ballots for Hurricane Milton? Very good. Very patriotic, very Republican. That's Ron DeSantis. How many ways can he save us from a hurricane? Isn't he amazing? Let's go to Reuters from Monday. Republicans lose bid to block Pennsylvania voters from curing mail-in ballots. Pennsylvania election officials will be able to notify voters of any mistakes in their mail-in ballots and let them make changes, the state's top court ruled, in a blow to Republicans who sought to block the practice in a state crucial to determining who will be the next U.S. president. In declining on Saturday to hear a lawsuit brought by the Republican National Committee and its state affiliate against so-called notice and cure procedures, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said the RNC filed the case too close to the November 5th election. The case is one of more than 120 voting-related lawsuits the RNC is involved with across 26 states. Republicans say they are trying to restore faith in elections by ensuring people don't vote illegally. But some legal experts and voting rights groups argue the legal blitz is meant to lay the groundwork to challenge potential losses and suppress votes for Democrats. And it's like we have another one of those Drake memes ready-made. Election-related lawsuits by Republicans, very bad. They're trying to suppress the vote. They're trying to disenfranchise people, and it's probably racist. Election-related lawsuits by Democrats, very good. They're trying to protect the vote, and as always, it's because they're anti-racist. In another ruling on Saturday, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court declined to hear a case brought by voting rights groups against a state requirement that mail-in ballots must bear the correct date in order to be counted. The court also said the case was brought too close to the upcoming election. In asking the court on September 18th to block county election boards from adopting notice and cure procedures, the RNC argued that the state's legislature had not granted the local boards the authority to adopt them. And you kind of have to marvel at that one. The boards don't have the authority to adopt these new rules. That's what's being argued. And the courts are like, it's just too close to the election. Sorry, the date on the calendar of this fake election is more important than whether or not the election to be held will be constitutional. Because here's the thing, none of them are, so why even fight it? In a September 20th court filing, the DNC and its state affiliate argued that the state's election laws indeed gave local boards the authority to implement such measures, and said the ruling the Republicans sought would prevent local officials from facilitating voter participation. Charles Lutvak, a spokesperson for Harris's fake campaign, in a statement called the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's decision a victory, not for Democrats, but for our democracy. And I always love a Reuters article because at the very bottom it always has a link to their standards, the Thomson Reuters Trust Principles. Reuters, a newswire that's a fully owned subsidiary of the global regime, has trust principles. Therefore, it is totally unbiased and everything printed in Reuters is 100% true. Let's shift to the Democracy Docket, the website of Uniparty lawfare attorney Mark Elias, formerly of Perkins Coie, the lawsuit representing Hillary Clinton and the DNC during the Russia hoax. In fact, Mark Elias and Perkins Coie were directly involved in the Russia hoax and named in Rico Grande, the Trump civil RICO filing that we discussed just a couple of weeks ago. The headline yesterday, judge dismisses case asking Governor Kemp to investigate Georgia State Election Board. A Fulton County judge dismissed a lawsuit Wednesday from Georgia Democrats asking Governor Brian Kemp to hold ethics hearings on the conduct of the MAGA members of the state election board. State Senator Nabila Islam Parks, former Fulton County Election Board Chair Kathy Woolard, and Georgia State Senate candidate Randall Mangum filed formal complaints against 3 members of the board in August after they passed controversial election rules. The controversial election rule, by the way, was one demanding that the ballots actually be counted to guarantee the number of ballots coming in and the reported number of ballots going out were fully reconciled. That's what they don't like. The judge ruled that a private citizen can't just designate something as a formal charge that the governor has to look into, and that formal charges must be derived from an investigation, according to reporting from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. This aligns with Attorney General Chris Carr's guidance in a September 6th opinion, where he stated that formal charges indicate, quote, the requirement of something more than simply a generalized grievance brought by a member of the public. One of the Democrats' complaints against the board members was that they voted to pass rules that, quote, favor one political party and its candidates over others in violation of the ethical requirement that board members never engage in other conduct which is unbecoming to a member or which constitutes a breach of public trust. Multiple lawsuits have been filed against the state election board over the last month, challenging rules the board passed that could delay election results and certification. A group of Georgia Democrats who are pursuing ethics charges against 3 MAGA Republican members of the Georgia State Election Board are suing GOP Governor Brian Kemp over his failure to hold a public hearing in the matter. So they are attempting to go after the members of the board for ethics violations because they did something related to the election in their capacity, in their job, that ostensibly makes it more difficult for the election fraud apparatus to function. These Democrats seem to be threatening the integrity of our democracy and our elections. Under Georgia law, when formal ethics charges are filed with the governor, alleging a violation of state laws governing the conduct of public officials and employees, the governor is required to conduct a hearing, quote, for the purpose of receiving evidence relative to the merits of such charges, end quote. The lawsuit says Kemp hasn't performed this duty. The plaintiffs are asking the Fulton County Court to compel Kemp to refer the charges to the Office of Administrative Hearings for a hearing on the ethics complaints. But Kemp's office indicated that the plaintiffs' ethics complaints, all of which are included in the lawsuit, aren't formal charges. In a statement to Democracy Docket, a spokesman said the office doesn't comment on pending litigation, but added that, quote, there have been no formal charges filed that would trigger the governor's statutory authority to take action on these matters. As he has done in the past, the governor will follow the laws and the Constitution of our state. Skipping ahead. In Tuesday's complaint, the plaintiffs say 3 board members changed rules and regulations, quote, to favor one political party and its candidates over the other, end quote, violating the ethical requirements we just went through above. The ethics complaint accuses the members of violating the state's open meetings law and ignoring counsel from the state attorney general's office when it held a July 12th meeting without public participation. Parker's complaint included in the lawsuit also accuses the members of illegally coordinating with the Georgia Republican Party and helping to aid former President Donald Trump in winning the state. So, as usual, this is a case of really just inconceivable levels of projection. The people who change election laws routinely to affect the desired outcomes on behalf of the Uniparty, on behalf of the global regime, are accusing these officials of doing the same to benefit Donald Trump in a traditionally red state that was rigged and stolen for Donald Trump, that he certainly won by a lot, a state that, we are told, re-elected Governor Brian Kemp by an 8-point margin in the 2022 midterms. Counting the number of ballots when they come in is presented as an effort to help Donald Trump win the election. And so consider just for a second, the answer will come to you immediately. Under what sort of circumstances would counting the ballots be considered an effort to help one party's candidates over the other? Oh, yeah, that circumstance is when the election is already rigged and stolen on behalf of the entities claiming counting the ballots is a partisan manipulation. Let's go to Zero Hedge on Tuesday. Texas demands Biden-Harris verify nearly 500,000 unverified voters. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton has demanded that the Biden-Harris administration turn over data to verify the citizenship status of nearly 454,289 registered voters in Texas. That, my friends, is extraordinary. Nearly 500,000 voters on the Texas voter rolls need their citizenship status verified? How is something like that possible? Well, it was probably just a series of 454,289 human errors, or maybe computer glitches. Or, hey, maybe, just maybe, the system was set up to produce exactly that situation. Why would they do that sort of thing? I mean, it can't be because elections are fake and they're trying to justify rigged and stolen election outcomes. Perhaps we should engage a government panel to study this for the next 10 years and let us know sometime in the future how something like this could happen. I'm sure the answer will be convoluted and complicated and not really an answer. In a letter addressed to U.S. CIS Director Jadu on Monday, Paxton raised concerns that these individuals may have unlawfully registered to vote without having their citizenship status confirmed. Paxton requested Jadu's assistance in identifying non-citizens on the voter rolls to ensure only eligible voters cast ballots in the 2024 presidential election, which is expected to be close. In a post on X, formerly Twitter, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton wrote, "I demand full cooperation from the federal government to ensure that any non-citizens remaining on Texas's voter registration rolls are identified. The Biden-Harris administration is legally obligated to assist states in doing so, and it is imperative that we use every tool available to uphold the integrity of our elections." Paxton's request follows an investigation by his office and Secretary of State Jane Nelson, which found individuals who registered to vote without providing a state driver's license or other state-issued identification. This, Paxton argued, made it near impossible for state officials to verify these individuals' citizenship. It is not immediately clear when these individuals were registered to vote. I am not asking for verification of the citizenship of anyone whose voter registration records contain a driver's license or state-issued identification number, Paxton clarified. According to Paxton, over 1,300 non-citizens were found registered to vote during an audit of 4 randomly selected counties. That is 1,300 too many when so many of our federal, state, and local elections are decided by a handful of votes, Paxton wrote. Paxton wrote that Texas has exhausted all available methods to confirm the citizenship status of the voters in question and is now demanding federal assistance. However, it is unlikely that the Biden-Harris administration will respond or cooperate with Texas on the issue. On September 27th, the DOJ filed a lawsuit against Alabama after Wes Allen, the Republican Secretary of State, inactivated the voter registrations of 3,251 individuals due to a lack of citizenship verification. And we discussed that on this podcast. The DOJ argued that Alabama's actions violated the National Voter Registration Act of 1993. Allen defended his decision in an interview with Headline USA, stating, "I was elected Secretary of State by the people of Alabama, and it is my constitutional duty to ensure that only American citizens vote in our elections. Why is the fake and illegitimate president's fake and illegitimate administration refusing to verify the citizenship status of 450,000 plus names on the Texas voter rolls?" It's like they don't even care about the possibility that an enormous number of non-citizens vote in American elections. And we're told not only that that sort of thing never happens, despite the obvious ability for it to happen constantly, we're told they would never want that to happen, despite the fact that they support it happening constantly. They legitimately tried to pass legislation so that that can happen. It's almost like they believe the United States of America is their corporation rather than our country, and they have a right to fill it up with as many of their slaves as they can, and then begin transferring our rights to their slave class. And of course, the strange and disturbing thing is that they've done this before, very likely with our own ancestors. Let's go to the Gateway Pundit from yesterday. Tina Peters releases her Mesa County voting system forensic examination to the public after sentencing by venomous Colorado judge. Gold Star mother and former county clerk in Colorado, Tina Peters, publicly released the Mesa County, Colorado voting system forensic examination and analysis reports before she was sent to prison for 9 years in another political prosecution. Tina Peters, a widow and Gold Star mother, has never violated any laws. She is 69 years old and will be 78 when the state releases her from prison. Tina asked her supporters to view her investigative reports on election integrity in Mesa County, Colorado. The reports 1 through 3 are found at tinapeters.us. Tina Peters argued in her investigation, the absence of secure hash algorithm .sha files for each digital ballot image makes the authenticity of each digital ballot image and the ballot level record for those ballots impossible to verify. And the true total vote count in Mesa County, Colorado cannot be accurately calculated for the 2020 general election or the 2021 Grand Junction municipal election from records in the databases of the county's voting system. So essentially, it is impossible to verify the results of Mesa County's elections. Why is that? Because the results are fake. Peters has always argued that backing up the election data from the Dominion system was lawful and required. Peters always insisted she has done nothing wrong, and it was well within her scope of responsibilities to back up the election records. In fact, in an interview with Steve Bannon on March 22nd, Peters said that, quote, the backup that she did was lawful and required by federal and state law. It has no PII or personal identifiable information of voters, end quote. After 7 days of trial in August, Peters was found guilty on 7 out of 10 charges. On Tuesday, and I think this should say last Thursday, Judge Michael Barrett lectured and scolded Peters before he sentenced her to 9 years in prison for downloading the election data, something she still argues was legal and appropriate. And the article concludes reiterating that those forensic reports are available on Tina Peters' website, tinapeters.us. Let's go to Axios from this morning. Behind the curtain, Dems blue wall blues. And the graphic that goes along with this article is a bit absurd. It's Kamala Harris with one finger raised, balancing Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, those states in a deep Ukraine blue and the background in a deep Ukraine yellow. It's like they're always trying to tell us something or something. Top Democrat politicians and operatives tell us the vital states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania are getting tougher for fake Vice President Harris and the party's Senate candidates. Harris is depending on that blue wall to win the White House, even if she struggles in the Sun Belt. On private calls, some top Harris allies are saying they believe the race will come down to Pennsylvania and Michigan. How about that? It almost doesn't even matter what happens anywhere else. It's all about Pennsylvania and Michigan. If Kamala Harris can just win those 2 states, she's going to be our next fake president. Why it matters. There's growing worry among Democrats that Harris seems stuck, even sliding a bit, after a strong start to her young presidential campaign. Her media blitz, heavy spending, and largely favorable coverage don't seem to be moving the needle much, if at all, these Democrats say. Yeah, isn't that strange? Her vibes-based, joy-based campaign that is being pushed in every way imaginable, while an equivalent negative force is being applied to everything Donald Trump does, can't seem to convince anyone that she's actually winning. But still, we're told it's a very close race over and over and over and over, according to all the fake polls. Pennsylvania is arguably the most important state on the map for Harris. Tell us who wins Pennsylvania, and we can tell you who's very likely to be president-elect. Oh, you see that? It's not even 2 states. It's really just 1. Harris, President Trump, and their allies plan to spend $350 million on TV ads in Pennsylvania, $142 million more than the next closest state, Michigan, the New York Times reports. Oh, yes, TV ads. They're what convince people to go out and vote for someone who they weren't intending to vote for. Or people just see those ads all the time, so when they are told that Kamala actually won the state because of how significantly she outspent Donald Trump, they'll say, yep, it's always worked that way. It's always been about those television ads. And Kamala Harris's ads, I just couldn't get enough of them. They reminded me how much I truly hate Donald Trump. And because I know from all those Trump signs everywhere that everyone else hates him too, those ads must have made the difference. Trump returned to Butler, Pennsylvania, the site of the first assassination attempt, for a massive rally with Elon Musk on Saturday, and held doubleheaders Wednesday in Scranton and Reading. Harris is heading to Erie for her 10th Pennsylvania visit on Monday, and her campaign says it knocked on 100,000 doors in the state on Saturday alone. Wow, she's crushing it. Michigan is the most complex swing state, where Democrat erosion among union members, Arab Americans, and young men all collide. It has one of just 3 Senate races the Cook Political Report rates as a toss-up, along with Ohio and Wisconsin. Wow, how about that? They can get 2-for-1s on the steal in Michigan and Wisconsin and get that corrupt old commie incumbent Sherrod Brown over the hump in Ohio. Those are the close ones. Last month, Representative Alyssa Slotkin, who's running for the Senate in Michigan, warned donors that her internal polling showed Harris was underwater in Michigan. In Wisconsin, Cook this week moved the re-election race of Senator Tammy Baldwin to toss-up from lean Democrat. Axios sneak peek last week scooped that Democrat insiders suddenly fear they could shockingly lose the critical contest. Trump on Sunday visited Wisconsin for the 4th time in 8 days. All that leaves Democrats along the blue wall desperate for traction, with Election Day now 26 days away. The Quinnipiac poll on Wednesday declared that the blue wall shows cracks as race tightens, with Harris slightly ahead in Pennsylvania and Trump holding an edge in Michigan and Wisconsin. A Detroit News poll this week said the vice president, quote, appears to have gained momentum, end quote, in Michigan with a 3-point lead over Trump. The poll shows 65% of Michiganders believe Trump's tariff plan would raise consumer prices. And of course, that is preposterous. Not only the premise that the tariffs would raise consumer prices, but also that 65% of Michiganders believe that. Or that even if they did, that would convince them to support Kamala Harris. Even this notion of a blue wall is ridiculous. Trump won all those states in 2016, and he won them all in 2020, at least on Election Day. Then, of course, overnight and throughout that post-election period, they were reported to have been won by Joe Biden from his basement, and then the lawfare apparatus sprung into action, led by Mark Elias, to support the quasi-legal justification for the impossible results that were reported. Back to the article. Reality check. Considering both polls' margins of error, it's all a big statistical tie, which top officials in both parties tell us is the true state of the race. You get that? Top officials said it's really even closer than the polls show. And if you don't believe the fake polls and unnamed top officials, you're a conspiracy theorist. A Harris official tells us the campaign, quote, always expected the blue wall to be this close, end quote. The official reminded us that during the Democrat convention, at the height of the Dems' sugar high, campaign chair Jen O'Malley Dillon said again and again, this would be a margin of error race. We're dealing with a polarized electorate, cycle after cycle. The pool of true swing voters just gets smaller and smaller, the official said. Axios is also telling us today, by the way, that the Democrats' hopes to remain in control of the Senate are relying on good news in long shot races, including ratings changes in their favor in Texas and Nebraska. So we're being told that the Democrats are going to flip Senate seats in Texas and Nebraska. How rigged and stolen would elections have to be for Democrats to win Senate seats in Texas and Nebraska? It's just so silly. Ted Cruz is going to be defeated by some guy named Colin Allred. We are supposed to believe that is possible. But hey, elections are fake, and the illegitimate administration is refusing to verify citizenship status for over 450,000 entries on the voter rolls for some reason. But let's take a step and think about this article for a second and what it is actually meant to convey, what it's meant to convince us, what it wants us to believe. Because this article was being shared this morning as good news. Kamala Harris understands that a whole slew of states are just slipping from her grasp. But what about Arizona? What about Georgia? What about North Carolina? Well, don't worry about any of that. All we need to do is get Michigan and Pennsylvania. That's what the election's going to come down to. Two of the states they are most adept at stealing, where the election fraud apparatus has been in place the longest. States controlled by Democrat officials who are already on the hook for multiple rigged and stolen elections in a row. The election is not about convincing the American people in all 50 states that you should be the president of the United States of America and will take office with the intent to serve the American people. No. What you have to do is just get the ball over the goal line in two states, two of the states with the worst elections in the country. Chris Matthews of MSNBC's Hardball fame used to talk regularly about how routinely Pennsylvania's elections were stolen by ward bosses exchanging a variety of favors for votes. But now we pretend their elections are totally legitimate, despite courts having ruled that Pennsylvania's elections were held under unconstitutionally changed election rules and processes in 2020. Free and fair, safe and secure. The courts found that there was no widespread fraud anywhere. It's insane that people still believe that. So this article is being sent around by Trump supporters as though it presents good news. Trump's got all these advantages. Kamala is clinging to dear life in Michigan and Pennsylvania, and everybody cheers. But to accept this story in full, you have to accept the truth of the underlying assumptions. And in doing that, you accept that the election really will come down to Pennsylvania and Michigan. And you got to understand that if the fake Kamala Harris campaign, if the uniparty media, if the regime media is putting out bad news about itself, it's so the article will go viral and confirm the truth of all the underlying assumptions. So what would you have to believe to accept this? A, we're in a real election. This is a real election where real votes are going to be counted properly, and the results of these elections will all be accurately reported in a way that makes us feel safe that if these elections were totally examined for the purposes of verification, the results, we are told, would accurately reflect the will and intent of the voters as expressed in the elections. Got to believe that, or else none of this makes sense. You also have to believe that Pennsylvania and Michigan are actually close races. And that, of course, is supported by nothing more than fake polls and prior fake election results. And in doing this, we allow the uniparty and their media to redefine winning the very real 2024 election to mean the TV declares a Kamala Harris victory in Michigan and Pennsylvania. They want us to believe that if the TV tells us Kamala Harris has won Michigan, Kamala Harris has won Pennsylvania, that means Kamala Harris is going to win the whole election, which we all knew was a possibility because it was such a close race, especially in those swing states like Michigan and Pennsylvania that are normally the quote-unquote blue wall, but are just too close to call right now. Kamala is underperforming in key demographics, but if she's able to right the ship in time, she'll not only win Pennsylvania and Michigan, she's going to win the whole thing. But enjoy your good news while it lasts, suckers. It is a strange desire and a product of the total inversion that people will happily share anything that seems like good news, even while what they're actually doing is cementing the narrative foundations for the steal. We need to stop groveling and trembling over fake elections. Stop being so desperate for allies. Stop being so desperate for good news. We can focus simply on telling the truth, analyzing these things through the lens of that truth, and responding correctly. We do not just simply need to grovel and give our power away because we're scared about what might happen if the TV tells us that Kamala, quote unquote, won. This is NBC News from yesterday. Afghan accused of plotting terror attack worked as CIA guard, officials say. An Afghan man arrested on charges of planning a terrorist attack on Election Day worked as a security guard in Afghanistan for the CIA, two sources with knowledge of the matter told NBC News. Nasir Ahmad Tawedi, 27, was arrested on Monday in Oklahoma and accused of plotting to kill Americans with an assault rifle on behalf of ISIS. Court documents said he contributed to an ISIS charity in March and accessed online ISIS propaganda, but they did not say whether he was radicalized before or after he came to the U.S. in 2021. Oh, wait, isn't that the year that the illegitimate administration flew all of those quote-unquote refugees over from Afghanistan during the Great Escape? I mean, obviously, not those people who were clinging to the landing gear of planes, or so we were told, just the other 100,000 people they got out of there, since, of course, that flight was not the last flight out of Kabul. That video was even more preposterous than the paragliding go-karts, and people still believe that really happened. One senior illegitimate administration official said counterterrorism officials assess that Tawedi became radicalized during the 3 years he lived in the U.S. A senior law enforcement official said the FBI is still investigating that question. It's like they're admitting that the unnamed senior administration official is lying. They want you to believe he became radicalized here so that they wouldn't face the accusation that they flew terrorists into our country under the pretense that they were refugees escaping Kabul before the Taliban took over. The CIA declined to comment. Court documents say Tawedi entered the country in September 2021, about a month after the U.S. military completed its chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan after 20 years of war. Every Afghan resettled in the U.S. undergoes a rigorous screening and vetting process, no matter which agency they work with, the official said. That process includes checking against a full range of U.S. records and holdings, the official said. So therefore, he definitely wasn't a terrorist before coming over here. It was his invitation to come to the United States and enjoy an American lifestyle that so radicalized him against America. A senior administration official familiar with the details said Tawedi passed 2 rounds of vetting with no derogatory information detected. Gosh, I hope this wasn't some sort of human error or computer glitch. The official said Tawedi was first screened before he entered the U.S. on what is known as humanitarian parole in September 2021, about 10 days after the last U.S. troops left Afghanistan. And you might remember being told by Jen Psaki that it was the most amazing humanitarian evacuation of all time. The source said he was vetted again while living in Oklahoma City when he applied for a special immigrant visa. He was eligible for the visa because he had worked for the U.S. government. He was approved for the visa, the official said, but he had not taken the final steps to make it official. Special immigrant visas are given to Afghans who worked with the U.S. in Afghanistan after they pass DHS screening. And wow, this guy must have been a real go-getter to only be 27 years old now and to have already worked for the U.S. government prior to 3 years ago. The sources familiar with his work in Afghanistan say he would have had minimal interaction with Americans, and he was not a CIA informant or a member of the U.S. trained and armed paramilitary force known as the Zero Units. Many of those fighters were evacuated to the U.S. after rigorous screening and vetting. Trust them. By the way, NBC links to an article on the NBC News website from August 29th, 2023, with the headline, Afghans who fought in secret CIA-trained force face legal uncertainty in the U.S. So I guess that's what these Zero Units are. Eventually, we'll hear the same about the regime's Azov friends from Ukraine. According to court documents, Tawedi indicated in seized communications that he planned his attack for Election Day, November 5th. Authorities said that in an interview after his arrest, he confirmed that the attack was intended to target large gatherings and that he expected to die a martyr. Authorities said he planned the operation along with a juvenile co-conspirator described as an Afghan citizen with legal permanent resident status. The pair were arrested after they met two confidential human sources and an undercover FBI agent who posed as business partners at a rural location in the Western District of Oklahoma to buy the rifles, 10 magazines, and ammunition for the planned attack. Man, isn't it amazing how our federal law enforcement and intelligence communities always know these people? Biden administration officials note that the complaint says the unnamed juvenile co-conspirator entered the country in 2018 during the Trump administration. That person also passed the vetting as well, a senior administration official said. All right, so that's a look at the election issues of this week. Now let's zoom out a bit to what it all means. This is CNN from this morning. And for whatever reason, it was updated this afternoon. As Trump delays transition process, Biden and Harris teams push forward with post-election planning. What in the world? Trump is delaying the transition process? How strange. Former President Donald Trump's team has blown past a pair of key deadlines for his presidential transition in a break from precedent that could have long-term national security ramifications. Oh no. With just over 100 days until a new president is inaugurated and less than a month until Election Day, delays in the transition planning could pose challenges for a peaceful transfer of power. And of course, we were told something very similar in the 2020 post-election period as well. Trump's team wasn't being helpful enough. In an environment of intense polarization and mistrust, Max Stier, the president and CEO of the nonprofit and nonpartisan Partnership for Public Service, totally sounds nonprofit and nonpartisan, starkly warned that transition activities are, quote, optional at real risk. Oh no, Trump is threatening national security again. You're going to need to engage, and if you don't engage, that will really put our country in jeopardy, he said, in reference to the Trump campaign, which has not yet entered formal transition agreements with the federal government. The next president will face major issues at home and abroad: the aftermath of a devastating hurricane season, an escalating conflict in the Middle East, and economic uncertainty. The aim of a presidential transition is to ensure that new leadership is able to hit the ground running on day one. Smooth transitions increase the likelihood of smooth presidencies, said Chris Liu, the executive director of former President Barack Obama's 2008 transition. Led by the White House Office of Management and Budget and the General Services Administration, transition planning began before the Republican and Democrat parties had selected their 2024 nominees, Democrats' last-minute change atop the ticket notwithstanding. Representatives from the Harris and Trump teams met separately with representatives from the Biden administration in recent weeks ahead of a pair of deadlines aimed at kicking off the process. Trump's transition team is chaired by Linda McMahon, who led the Small Business Administration through his first term, and Cantor Fitzgerald CEO Howard Lutnick. Harris has selected the same person who led the process for President Joe Biden, Johannes Abraham, the former Indonesia-based ambassador to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. What? By September 1st, both campaigns were expected to sign a memorandum of understanding with the GSA that gives them access to office space, communications, equipment, and IT support. The campaigns are also expected to submit an ethics plan and to identify the initial people who would need security clearances to begin receiving classified information during a transition. Man, those sound like really important steps. I wonder why the Trump team wouldn't be on top of something like this. Is it because they don't want to give the illegitimate Biden regime this sort of information, or is it because it doesn't matter at all? To date, GSA has entered into an MOU, that's Memorandum of Understanding, with the Harris transition team outlining the terms for spaces and services, and is prepared to provide services to the Trump transition team once an MOU is executed and services are accepted, a GSA spokesman said. The Harris team has also submitted its ethics plan, and the Trump team has not. So much of what they will need in order to be prepared to run our government depends on having access to information and resources that are dependent upon that MOU, Steer said, adding, "The clock is running, and there are things they aren't getting." Oh no, it's just so sad that the Trump team is upsetting some guy. The Trump campaign did not respond to CNN's request for comment. The federal transition coordinator, a White House spokesperson, told CNN, is actively working with the former president's transition team to complete its MOU. Oh gosh, hopefully they'll get it done sometime. By October 1st, both the Harris and Trump campaigns were expected to sign a separate memorandum of understanding with the White House, detailing the terms of access to agencies, including personnel, facilities, and documents. Man, does the Trump team just not want that stuff or something? And by the way, what White House are they referring to? Are they just using the euphemism for the illegitimate Biden administration, or are they referring to something emanating from that actual building? Because that's a little harder to discern now that there's a fake White House across the street in the Eisenhower Executive Office building where Joe Biden signs important papers and conducts important business of the country from his little tiny desk. And then there's that other fake White House down the street on Pennsylvania Avenue that we're told is nothing more than a museum that just so happens to have what we're told is an exact replica copy, indistinguishable from Joe Biden's massive ancient family Bible. Now, I would never imply that that space was copied so exactly so that they could simply film their scenes there rather than attempting to gain access to the actual White House, which for some reason seems really difficult for the fake president. I would never say anything like that because that sounds like a conspiracy theory, even though it is just a perfect recitation of actual facts about our situation. The Harris campaign and the quote-unquote White House completed their MOU shortly after the October 1st deadline. Whoops, I guess. Trump's transition effort has yet to sign on, though Steer indicated conversations are ongoing. Why does this guy at the nonprofit, nonpartisan Partnership for Public Service have such insight into all of this? Skipping ahead. Career officials, of which there are more than 2 million, generally serve from administration to administration, while political appointees, of which there are about 4,000, serve under one president and resign at the start of a new administration, though they can stay if asked by the new team. Every government agency was required to identify a succession plan for all of its senior political officials by September 15th. And by November 1st, each agency must have briefing materials prepared for the eventual president-elect's team. Man, I can't believe Donald Trump is just going to leave these poor people hanging. They might not even be privy to what these people say Trump should do in his next term. The horror. The goal of those briefing materials is to help inform the next administration about what is facing them coming in, what the problems are, and what the administration has done to address them, and where they think priorities should be in the future. According to Valerie Boyd, director of the Center for Presidential Transition at the Partnership for Public Service. Man, these people are really involved. Those materials focus less on policy and more on organizational structure, logistical information, and topics like budget processes and the distribution of political appointees. The memos and briefing materials serve as a useful guide to help organize the expected conversations between the Biden administration and the next administration's transition team, a senior administration official told CNN. While organizations like Steers have worked to institutionalize the transition process in recent years, the specter of partnerships looms large, leading to questions of how or whether such briefing materials would be used by a future administration. Several Biden appointees who also served under Obama have suggested their experience preparing the 2016 transition has provided both muscle memory and a cautionary tale. Hours spent preparing memos and briefings could be met by an incoming administration that has no desire or need for them. We were waiting for the phone calls from the Trump team, waiting for people to show up, and they never did. They never took our memos, says one senior official who has served under both Biden and Obama. Why can't they ever name these people? The Trump campaign, this official said, has, quote, not shown any indication they want to use anything that we provide to them, end quote. In a scenario where Harris wins the election, much of the institutional knowledge of the current administration would remain intact, not unlike when Obama won re-election in 2012. You're kind of in a funny situation now, where one side may not want the briefings. The other side doesn't really need the briefings because it's a friendly takeover, a former Democrat transition official told CNN. Now let's hear about how all of this is a national security threat. In 2020, as the Supreme Court awaited a recount in Florida, neither George W. Bush nor Al Gore's teams were participating in a transition, something the 9/11 Commission report found was a contributing factor to the September 11th, 2001 terror attacks. Congress enacted some changes to the Presidential Transition Act to address this matter in 2022, shifting some responsibility away from the GSA. Wait a second. The illegitimate Biden administration, with the help of the illegitimate Congress, made changes to the Presidential Transition Act in 2022 to address some obviously fictional nonsense stemming from September 11th? Who would ever buy something so absurd? And by the way, are they just disgracing the memory of all the victims of the September 11th, quote unquote, terror attacks by exploiting their loss and the country's loss to change the laws in ways that help the uniparty? I would say yes, but of course, I'm a conspiracy theorist. Back to the article. If the election's outcome is unknown for 5 days, the revised law states that access to federal agencies will officially open up to more than one eligible candidate, meaning that both Trump and Harris's teams would participate in transition activities. I mean, unless, of course, they don't want to, I guess. Federal agencies need to be prepared to provide equal access to information to two candidates' teams if the election outcome is unknown on November 10th, said Boyd. And I guess we're supposed to assume that that remains true despite the election being fake. Trump has also indicated that he plans to enact sweeping changes for career officials in federal government, including changing thousands of those jobs into politically appointed positions, CNN has reported. Policy experts have warned that federal workers could be fired unless they put loyalty to Trump ahead of serving the public interest. Well, it's not loyalty to Trump that MAGA is concerned with. It's loyalty to the United States of America. These officials have not shown that in any respect. They have shown that they are only loyal to the power of the uniparty bestowed on the uniparty by the global regime. They work to implement an agenda that is adverse to the priorities of the American people. The extent to which they work in the public interest at all is the extent to which the uniparty is able to convince the American people that any of their agenda is actually in the public interest. Those experts warn that the moves would hollow out and politicize the federal workforce, force out many of the most experienced and knowledgeable employees, and open the door to corruption and a spoils system of political patronage. Well, that sounds very scary, those experts. but we're just going to take our chances. One key question facing Harris, should she win, is if or how she plans to leverage the existing political appointees, including cabinet officials from the Biden administration. Wait a second. Is the entire illegitimate Biden administration just going to stay there because they could never possibly be confirmed again? And because the federal government might just end up being dissolved? Nah, that can't be it. Everything is just still working fine, as the television says. There are some strong reasons why continuity would help her, including the fact that if you're a Senate-confirmed leader in the government and the Biden administration, you do not have to be reconfirmed for that position in a potential Harris administration, Steer said. Oh yeah, that is the reason. Given expected tight margins in the Senate, that could have advantages for Harris. Man, it's really starting to sound like they're creating a premise to shut down the elections and just keep their government in power, just like the same people did with their government in Ukraine. Or, so we're told. The article concludes this way. 3 people familiar with the vice president's planning said that her transition apparatus will not be making personnel decisions before the election, acknowledging that the composition of the Senate will have significant bearing on whom she selects for certain roles. Harris has made one commitment thus far, to appoint a Republican to her cabinet. Oh gosh, how even-handed, conciliatory, and patriotic. Will it be Liz Cheney? Gosh, I can't wait to find out. So what do we have here? Trump is not even getting involved in the transition process? We were promised a smooth transition to a second Trump administration. Did that happen through the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021? Or is it going to happen through the end of 2024 and the beginning of 2025? Who's to say? Is it possible that no transition will even be required? We actually won't have to have the military come and remove the fake President Joe Biden and the fake Vice President Kamala Harris and all their surrounding stooges from power because they're not really in power in the first place? That can't be it. That's just a conspiracy theory. The television told us that Joe Biden won the 2020 election. The very trustworthy election officials in the regimes in the uniparty's election fraud apparatus told us everything was free and fair, safe and secure, and that the reported results accurately reflected the will and intent of the American voters. And the regime-aligned courts agreed with the uniparty's lawfare apparatus, led especially by Mark Elias, that everything had been run perfectly. So perfectly that most of the courts decided that they didn't even need to take the cases, and virtually every court decided that they didn't need to see any evidence. It was just clear that Joe Biden actually received 81 million real lawful American votes, and that to even hint otherwise was a dire threat to our democracy and a repetition of the big lie. And sure, elite, regime-aligned think tanks claim that countries have 2 presidents on a fairly regular basis if they don't like the fact that a president who opposes the regime is actually in office. Claiming that someone else is actually president is only a bad thing when people who oppose the regime are doing it. So it happens elsewhere with regularity. It's certainly not anything new, but it could never, ever happen here. I mean, it couldn't happen here, right? Well, let's just explore the possibility. This is from the West Virginia legislature this week. It is House Concurrent Resolution 203. It is a bill that you can find at wvlegislature.gov. Let's go through it. Requesting that the West Virginia legislature shall not recognize an illegitimate presidential election. Whereas a constitutionally valid government only exists and endures when elections are conducted in accordance with all applicable legal requirements and are free of violence or threats of violence, government manipulation, censorship, coercion, fraudulent voting or manipulation of votes, election tabulation, and or election results by any means whatsoever. And that whereas in the 2024 election cycle, there have been, to date, 2 assassination attempts on the Republican nominee for president of the United States, while threats of assassination of the Republican nominee for president and vice president abound. The federal government, under the current Democrat-led regime, has utterly failed and continues to fail in a suspicious manner in its absolute duty to adequately protect the Republican nominee for president. And that, whereas the constitutions of the United States and the state of West Virginia require that only legal citizens may vote in U.S. and West Virginia elections, and that there is abundant evidence that non-citizens have been and are being registered to vote in the national election of 2024. Therefore, be it resolved by the legislature of West Virginia that the sovereign state of West Virginia declares it will not recognize an election for president if such election is enabled by illegal or fraudulent acts. And be it further resolved that the state of West Virginia will not recognize any election of the Democrat candidate for president during the 2024 election cycle if the Republican presidential or vice presidential candidate is assassinated, seriously injured during an assassination attempt, incarcerated, de facto eliminated, or barred from the ballot in any states, or is the subject of legal actions that preclude their effective campaigning. And be it further resolved that the state of West Virginia will not recognize an election of a candidate for president during the 2024 election cycle if the Attorney General of West Virginia or the Secretary of State of West Virginia, in consultation with the West Virginia legislature, determined that election fraud in any state was a major reason that resulted in a candidate for president obtaining a majority in the Electoral College. Election fraud includes non-citizen voting, vote buying, ballot forgery, illegal or illicit ballot harvesting, illegal or illicit discarding of legal votes or voter registrations, ballot miscounts, algorithmic manipulation of votes or vote tabulations, cyber attack or manipulation, or intimidation. Election fraud also includes interference by any government entities, including arrests or prosecutions for apparent political motives or other forms of persecution using legal or official processes to negatively affect an electoral process, or a political entity participating in an electoral process using unconstitutional, extra-constitutional, illegal, or otherwise illegitimate means, including those under the color of law or office. And be it further resolved that the state of West Virginia will not recognize an election of a candidate for president if the Attorney General of West Virginia or the Secretary of State of West Virginia, in consultation with the West Virginia legislature, determine that election interference by the federal government, foreign governments, or other state governments was a key factor that resulted in a candidate for president obtaining a majority in the Electoral College. Election interference includes censorship, information suppression or manipulation, or other unconstitutional, extra-constitutional, illegal, or otherwise illegitimate actions by the federal government, foreign governments, or other state governments, either directly or in collusion with elements of the media, social media entities, information entities, or political entities. And be it further resolved, thereupon a determination by the legislature of West Virginia, in consultation with the Attorney General and Secretary of State, of either the illegal or illicit elimination of the Republican presidential or vice presidential candidate during the 2024 election cycle, or election fraud or election interference resulting in the constitutionally illegitimate selection of a president during the 2024 election cycle, the legislature will be called into special session by the governor to consider actions to preserve the freedom of our people. And it ends with a resolution to submit this document to the state officials as well as the United States Congress. So West Virginia is essentially already declaring that they will not, under any circumstances, recognize Kamala Harris as a president-elect or president if they are able to push her through, because each and every one of those standards has already been met in 2024 and was met in 2020. And we are just assuming that all of the states across the country recognized Joe Biden's legitimacy as president in 2020 and 2021, simply because the television has not told us otherwise, and because if something like that happened, it wouldn't have been revealed publicly. Now, I'm not trying to prove to you that this is already the case for the 2020 election in West Virginia or any other state. I am only proposing the possibility because each and every one of these standards is met not only this year in this fake election cycle, but was met in 2020, which unfortunately was also a fake election cycle. So how about that? The state can just declare that the uniparty's selection for the winner of a fake election will not be recognized as legitimate and therefore will not ever be recognized as president. Isn't that a threat to our democracy? No, it's just a state reclaiming its own sovereignty under the Constitution. But here's the thing. Neither the federal government nor the government of the states can claim any right not already possessed by the people and delegated to the government. That is at the heart of the 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights under our Constitution. Aside from a blatant use of force against the states, how can the federal government compel the states to recognize its legitimacy? Outside of a use of force, I would assume that the only other way they could do that is by cutting off federal funds. So I guess West Virginia would have to be prepared to forego federal funding. What would happen if a number of states did this? Trump is already advertising a step-by-step process by which the federal income tax will be eliminated. Federal funding is generally apportioned based on state populations, and those are, of course, inflated massively by adding illegal aliens to the total. And a lot of the federal funding is going to dry up already because Trump is talking about eliminating a slew of agencies and entire departments like the EPA and the Department of Education. And I would imagine that the Department of Homeland Security is probably at the top of the list. So would states be depending on federal funding that they already can't depend on? And if that's the only leverage, if that's the only threat outside of overt state violence, how would this corrupt and illegitimate federal government bring the states to heel? The 10th Amendment reads as follows. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. But it starts with the people, and the people convey and delegate the powers to the states, and then collectively they convey and delegate powers to the federal government. But the state has no rights not possessed by the people. If the state can deem that the federal government is illegitimate, so too certainly can the people. The 10th Amendment does not allow governments to exercise rights not possessed by the people. This is not new. Our founders told us this. Thomas Jefferson demanded it of us. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. So we have the justification, the right, and the duty not to recognize illegitimate governments, and yet people are doing it anyway. But the question is, does Donald Trump, does the military, who is actually in power, two presidents are possible. The regime tells us that themselves. So why in the world would we recognize their guy when their guy has no way of justifying his own legitimacy? That's not even possible for Kamala Harris, who, unless she's a secret agent, has already been committing treason for years, regardless of whether or not she is declared the winner of a fake election. It is our choice to recognize the legitimacy of a president. We can't be forced to do that, legally or otherwise. But instead, we grovel and tremble and hope that the TV will tell us that Donald Trump won a fake election to finally feel empowered to tell the truth about who the president is. This is our choice. It always has been. If we don't communicate that choice, then we are the ones denying the public mandate to Donald Trump that he just reiterated is what he really needs. He said plenty of times, we have all the votes we need. We just need to protect the vote. And unfortunately, after 2020, no one really wanted to do that. I mean, who are we to argue with the television? Who are we to argue with the legitimacy of the fake president? Only the regime is allowed to argue with a president's legitimacy, as it continued to do throughout Donald Trump's entire term. But we were told we were telling the big lie. We were told we were threatening democracy. We were told we were committing insurrection. And for whatever reason, people are still prepared to grovel and take it. Because I guess they want the hose again. And if they want it that bad, they're going to get it. But hopefully one more spray will wake them right up. Because the truth is, we really don't need another transition. And recognizing that fact, which provides that public mandate, will mean that the transition already occurred. I'll be back tomorrow at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic. And Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening for free and would like to support the show, the best way to do that is by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can find the info stream over on Telegram at t.me/veryreasonable. The merch site is cancelcouture.com. And for all my other links, you can visit linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon down on the range.